Good day. I am Jolina Gabao, the first reporter of Group 1. The coverage of my report is from the Arabic literature or Arabian literature, Arabian prose and poetry, and Quran. At the end of the lesson, the students are expected to understand the Arabian literature, differentiate the Arabic prose and poetry, and define Quran. So for our introduction, let us first discuss the history of Saudi Arabia. So Arabs is originated on the descendants of indigenous tribes and live along the Persian Gulf coast. Arabian Peninsula is also the homeland of Islam, the world's second largest religion. Muhammad found Islam there, and it is the location of the two holy pilgrimage cities of Mecca and Medina. So, a succession of invaders attempted to control the peninsula. By 1517, the Ottoman Empire dominated, and in the middle of the 18th century, it was divided into separate principalities. So next is the trivia of the Saudi Arabia. The Kingdom of Saudi Arabia is almost entirely of King Ibn Saud 1882 to 1953. A descendant of Wahhabi leaders, he seized Riyadh in 1901 and set himself as leader of the Arab nationalist movement. The Hejaz and Najd regions were merged to form the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia in 1932, which an absolute monarchy ruled by Sharia. Also, in 1745, Muhammad ibn al-Wahhab began calling for the purification and reform of Islam, and the Wahhabi movement swept across Arabia. Wahhabis had been driven out of power again by the Ottomans and their Egyptian allies. So the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. There is the flag of Saudi Arabia and Arabian Desert. So facts about the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. So their capital is Riyadh, their language is Arab, their religion is Islam. So for their economy, Saudi Arabia occupies most of the Arabian Peninsula and is the largest country in the area in the Middle East. But 95% of the land is desert. Mountains running parallel to Red Sea slope down to plains along the Persian Gulf. Desert Kingdom, one of the wealthiest nations in the world. So next is the cultures and traditions of Saudi Arabia. First is the pork. Pork is considered unclean and is prohibited. Lunch is traditionally the day's main meal. Next is the alcohol consumption. It is the nightlife are forbidden. In Saudi Arabian women are required according to Islamic law to cover their bodies in abaya, black robes, and face coverings as a sign of respect for Muslims' modesty laws. Next is the large extended families. So large extended families live together and nepotism is encouraged. Next is storytelling. Storytelling is another favorite form of artistic expression, but in keeping with Islamic law, guidelines govern public performances, and artists can't make graven images. Hand-lettered Qurans are considered sacred art that's to be respected. So lastly is the Ramadan. Ramadan is the holiest season, so it marks as their fasting. So next is their clothing for women and for men from Saudi Arabia. Next is the Arabian literature. So Arabian literature is a written Arabic literature began to be known with the collect of Quran, the sacred book of Islam. In Arabia in 17th century AD, with the spread of Islamic faith into Asia, Africa, and Europe, the Arabian language soon became a major world language. So before we tackle the pre-Islamic, the Arabian literature of today is read or understood by hundreds of millions of people, even before the revelations of Muhammad were collected in the Quran. However, the Arabs possess a highly developed poetry composed of recitation and transmitted from generation to generation. The most famous examples are elaborated odes or kasdas of Mu'alagat, or the suspended odes, beginning with those of Imru al-Qiyas. These poems reflected and praised the customs and values of the desert environment in which they arose. So for the pre-Islamic, the structure of Arabic language is well suited to harmonious patterns with elaborated rhymes and rhythms. So the earliest known literature emerged in northern Arabia around 500 AD and took the form of poetry which was recited aloud, memorized and handed down from one generation to another. It began to be written down towards the end of 7th century. So the most celebrated poems of the pre-Islamic period were known as the Mu'algat, or the suspended, reputedly because they were considered sufficiently outstanding to be hung on the walls of the Kaaba in Makkah. So the typical poem of this period is Qasida or ode, which normally consists of 70 to 80 pairs of half line. Traditionally, they describe the nomadic life, opening with a lament at an abandoned camp for a lost love. The second part praises the poet's horse or camel and describes a journey with the hardships it entails. The third section contains the main theme of the poem. Next is the historical period. The first one is the Umayyad period. So in Umayyad period, Arabic prose literature was limited primarily to grammatical treatises, commentaries on the Quran, and the compiling of stories about Muhammad and his companions. So the Umayyad or the Umayyad poets, chief of whom were Al-Aqtal and Al-Farazdak, favored poetic forms such as love lyrics called ghazals, wine songs, and hunting poems. These forms of conditions of life and manners found in the territories conquered by Islam. So next is the Abbasid Empire. So in Abbasid Empire, in the early years of this empire, many forms were invented for Arabic literature, which then entered what is generally regarded its greatest period of development and achievement. It is certain that Persian influences contributed significantly to this development. For example, translations from Persian, such as those of Ibn al-Muqaf, led to a new refinement in Arabic prose or Sajj, the style of Quran. The greatest masters of adab were Al-Jahiz and Al-Hariri. So, an inventive type of folk literature, exemplified in the Thousand and One Nights, popularly known as the Arabian Nights, drew upon the recitations of wandering storytellers called rawis. So for the Abbasid Empire, which is began 750 to 1258, Abu Nuwas was acknowledged as the foremost among the new poets who used the Arabic language with greater freedom and imagination. So an experimental tradition, now viewed with classical traditions, some poets excelled in both traditions. So Al-Ma'ari and Al-Matanabi are regarded as the greatest among them. So in Spain, an independent poetic tradition culminated in the exquisite lyrics of Ibn Zaidun, and Ibn Quzman. The Romance of Antar, closest work to an epic in Arabic, was also written about this time. So next is the modern period. So in modern period, rather, during the centuries of Ottoman Turkish domination, Arabic literature fell into decline. Not until the mid-19th century was it revived by its intellectual movement known as Nada, or the Reawakening, which originated to Syria and spread to Egypt. For the modern period, from being imitative to Europeans, modern Arabic literature, both prose and poetry, has gradually freed itself from centuries of neglect and has assumed its former place among the world's greatest literatures. So next we will tackle about the Arabic writers, which is the Arabic writers of the past 100 years have been extremely versatile. Most of their work is characterized by strong concern for social issues. So, some of the outstanding among the recent Arabic novelists, dramatists, and essayists. The first one is Tawfiq al-Hakim, novelist Naguib Mahfouz, Taha Hussein, and poets Ihya Abu Madi, Adonis Ahmad Shawgi, Abu Shadi, and Abbas al-Akkad. So next is the Arabic prose. So Arabic prose, Sajj or rhymed prose, is most striking characteristic features of the Arabic prose. It is consists of succession of pairs of short rhyming expression with rhetorical and antithetical balance of sense of between pairs of expressions with a certain loss of rhythmical balance not bound by strict meter. So the khutbah, or formal written in rhyme prose style, is of great antiquity, turned out to be religious verses in the earliest time of Islam. So the most is the Ibn Nubata at Farigi. The most celebrated of Ibn Muqaffa is Qila wa Dimna, which is translation from a Pahlavi version of the Indian fable Panchatantra. Arabic prose began in the latter days of Umayyad Empire. It exhibits use of khutbah style and more sophisticated and fluent style derived from the literary traditions of Sasanian Persian. Next is the Golden Age of Arabic prose. So studied with the name of brilliant writers such as the essayist Al-Jahiz and Abu Hayyan Al-Tawhidi and the critic Ibn Qutayba. It was also during the period that the works of Abwal al-Ma'ari become popular with his letters in Sajj and the Risalat al-Ghufran, which pictures a visit to the other world. So more instructive, assuring anecdotes became popular too, and the most outstanding compiler of anecdotes was Tanuki, who was responsible of the 3 compilations. So the 3 compilations are Niswar al-Muharrada, the Table of the Mesopotamian Judge, Mustajad, Anecdotes of Generosity, Farabad al-Shida, Deliverance after Agish. So these kinds of works led to a new literary form, makamat or assemblies initiated by al-Hamadhani. So let's move on with the Arabic poetry. So there is not much evidence of written literature among the Arabs before the Islamic period. So oral traditions, the poetry of the North Arabs, particularly the Bedouin tribes of the 5th and 6th centuries, are the most outstanding in the artistry and sensuousness of feelings. So, poetry was constructed in elaborate meters, which 16 are universally recognized. So, all verses are divided into types. So, the first one is occasional poems. The second one is the collection or anthologies. So, occasional poems, occasional poems consisting of 2 to 20 lines whose themes are usually war and revenge and praise of one's own tribe. So the various genres fall for this are elegies, praising the dead. The most famous type was cansa. The odes or quasida was an elaborate ode usually of 60 to 100 lines. Themes were usually about exploits of narrator, his old passion and description of camp life in honor for his patron. Then next, the oral transmission of poems was lasted for 350 years. So the next one is the collection or anthologies. Al-Mu'allaqat, a group of pre-Islamic ode. There are three kinds of collection. So Al-Mu'allaqat means suspended because these poems were supposed to have been displayed by the Arabs on the Kaaba at Mecca. These collections are ascribed to Hamd al-Rawisha in the 18th century AD by Amru Uykais, most illustrious of Arabian poets, showed the nomadic life, views and philosophies, visions and their dreams arising from such condition. So next is Al-Hamasa, is an anthology by poets Abrataman about 836 AD. So derive its name from the beginning of books and poems. Themes were usually about valor and constant battles, patience when comforted reality, seeking vengeance, pagan rituals, myths, temptations, treasure, and Arab traditions. Then next is the Mujaddiyat. Mujaddiyat is a collection of poems named after Mufadalibin, who compiled them for the future Caliphate between 762 and 784, showed hospitality, charity, valor, faithfulness, lavish entertainment, love for wine, and love for chance. So in the first century after the death of Muhammad in 622 AD, called Umayyad period, there were no outstanding literary productions, but there were four noteworthy poets. These are the Akhatal, Farazdak, Jarir, Durumma. The Qasidas, a type of literature, was becoming stereotyped, but the vogue of court poetry became popular. So the Abbasid period, which is lasted 750 to 1258 AD, the classical tradition kept faith with the past, particularly desert poetry, with the modification, the substitution for the old imaginative phrases of rhetoric types, a fashion set by Muslim Ibn Waqdi, followed by Tamman and extravagantly Mutanabi. Some critics often call this period as the Golden Age up to 1055 AD and 1258 as Silver Age. Poets become more original in their crafts, influenced by Hellenistic and Persian art. So, some of the outstanding authors are Ibn Ishaq, author of Muhammad Life, Rabja of Basra and Sufi poets, Abu Nuwaybas, greatest Arab lyricist. The famous Muqammat is attributed to Hariri, one of the popular prose romances. The most famous are the 10,001 Nights, the Voyages, of Sinbad and the collection of the fables related to the Greek Aesop ascribed to Luqman. After the fall of Baghdad in 1258, there was ascendance of Mongol, Turkish, and Persian influence, and waning considerable historical and biographical writings existed, like the Romance of Antar about the popular Islamic hero and finalization of the 10,001 Nights under the Mameluke rule 1250 to 1517 from Egypt. In 1282, Ibn Khalikan made the first biographical dictionary. In 354, Ibn Battuta, traveler the biographer, wrote about the travels in the gift of the observers and the marvels of countries. In 1453, the Turks of Constantinople, and by 1492, the Arab rule in Spain has ended. After the defeat of Napoleon, Hassan al-Arai organized European lectures. Then later, he became director of Al-Azhar University in Cairo. He restored the Western culture and ushered an Nada or Renaissance of Arabic culture. Next is the Renaissance of Arabic culture, An-Nada. The national reawakening or consciousness from 1880s onwards, Egyptians were concerned with the scientific works. Great names includes Brutus al-Bustani in Syria, Al-Tataw, Ali Mubarak, and Abdullah Fikri Said in Egypt, Jamaluddin al-Afghani was the reformist and the orator of the period. So, Renaissance of Arabic culture was marked by the introduction of new ideas and new methods, imitations, and at the same time, reform and development of the traditional Arabic literature. So, the opening of the Suez Canal in 1869, the revolt of Arabian Pasha, and the entry of British troops at Egypt, which strengthened the Western influence. The historical novel Muhammad by Abduk Zirpe Zaidan, and master of the modern Arabic prose Al-Anfalutu. So in America, the greatest poets among the Arab immigrants are Animal Raihani of story writers, Khalil Gibran for artist and philosopher, Mohailo no Agma influenced by Russians for as the writer of the Note America. So lastly is the Quran. So Quran is the sacred scripture of Islam. Muslims really acknowledge it as the actual words of God revealed by Muhammad. So Quran contains 114 chapters or surahs, arranged except for the opening approximately according to length, beginning with the longer chapters. It is termed as the glorious and wonderful, describes the absolute truth, healing mercy, light and guidance of God to people's everyday lives. It has a great contribution with the Arabian literature. So again, I am Jolina Gabao. That ends of my slide and my report. So thank you for listening and God bless.